The voice of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Hey, welcome back again. This is Arlene and you are listening to Adrian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today in our third segment for our ASEAN breakfast call, which is the ABC dialogue, we have our guest today, Adrian Pereira. He's working in Dignity International and currently he is also doing a lot of groundwork in terms of trying to exert more regional awareness on ASEAN as well as youth participation in the Southeast Asian region. So, Adrian Pereira, tell us more. What are you doing what is your role in Dignity International?
Dignity International is an international human rights organization. We are happy to be based in Malaysia, PJ, and we work on economic, social, and cultural rights. So, since there are many NGOs that are working on civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights is not dealt with sufficiently, and hence Dignity has taken up the mandate. And we work with different partners from urban and rural poor, mainly in empowering them on the rights-based approach to solving poverty, oppression, and after a series of processes of empowerment, we are now focused more on advocacy on different issues. So in my work in Dignity, I have, of course, got a chance to work with many youth from all over Asia and especially ASEAN. And I'm happy to be able to share any of my experiences here with all of you on this interview.
So, you have been participating since 2006, is it? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, in the ASEAN processes, and I think the ASEAN and its governments and the people, of course, most importantly, have been trying to set up different mechanisms to promote human rights and social justice in the region. And I think, and I've seen young people play a very important role, especially in building cross-border solidarity. And I think why this is important is, as we all know, that ASEAN's original intention of being formed was for security reasons and also economic reasons in the region. Especially in terms of cooperation and exchanging information. But of course, over the years, the functions have evolved, and as people become more aware of their human rights and liberties, they have demanded that the ASEAN governments play an important role to ensure that human rights and social justice is mainstreamed within the ASEAN itself. And I think I've joined a few different meetings where the ASEAN government and civil society comes together. And I've seen there's a bit of progress in terms of developing certain mechanisms. But even though it's slow, I think it's important that young people play a role and push the agenda forward.
So, just talking about your participation in the ASEAN mechanism, especially when it comes to youth participation in human rights matters, but what is the current human rights status in Southeast Asia? Is it really that bad, or is it actually still in a process of moving forward?
ASEAN actually has the capacity and even the capability to be a game changer. Not just in this region, but globally, because of its economic capacity and even its democracy situation. If you take a look now at what's happening in ASEAN, it's quite exciting actually. You look at Thailand, there's a military coup that's happening, and over in Indonesia, there's a it's a very strong political campaign for the next president, and I think the whole world is actually watching to see how things turn up, and if some models of social justice can be implemented through this new type of democracy and political economy. So for me, I think youth participation has played a role. I think in terms of keeping the new generation of social thinking alive. Of course, the context of social justice and human rights is actually quite bad. I mean, I won't mince my words, and hence all the more people should get involved. Of course, compared to the situation which our seniors faced in the 70s and 80s, social injustice wasn't so complex, and hence all the more we young people have to engage more creative ways, in more critical ways on how to improve the human rights situation in ASEAN. Yeah.
So your experience since 2006 until 2014, I guess, what kind of transformation, or is it getting better, or is it getting lesser in terms of the way both how the youth sort of voices out their views related to ASEAN's human rights, and also the way the government receive all these views and voices?
If we look at youth participation, we'll have to have a discussion at the more formal level, where the governments have their own youth associations and student exchanges. Of course, it's still at a very superficial level, but I think in terms of civil society, young people have, in the past few years, taken a more critical stand to break out from this old framework of thinking, to develop their own agendas, of course, related to human rights, but in a more creative way for ASEAN. For example, the ASEAN Youth Forum, which also happens simultaneously with the ASEAN Civil Society meetings, which happens in parallel when governments have their meetings. Of course, it's still needs a bit more sharpening in terms of the right-based approach. But I think more importantly is how ASEAN youth intervene in cross-border human rights and social justice issues. I think this will be the yardstick of how we can evaluate the effectiveness of ASEAN youth in this region. For example, I personally do a bit of work on migration and peace and conflict in the region, and I can see so many young people directly affected by these two issues, conflict and migration. And we will have to create more spaces of young people coming together to look for solutions. Why is there conflict, even though it's 2014? Despite years of experiences in human rights and social justice with the UN system, why is it that this very bad conflict happening, even though we have, this is the age of diplomacy, the age of globalization, and this, of course, refers specifically to the work I do in Patani, which is just across a few hours away from Kuala Lumpur, and also West Papua, which is part of Indonesia. So ASEAN still hasn't opened up enough to address these two issues, of course, because of its policy on non-intervention and consensus. So it will be up to the young people to mainstream these issues and play a role in the peace-building processes.
So when you say that it's because of the ASEAN Charter itself that sort of hinder like meaningful discussion and participation among young people towards ASEAN, but is there in any way that young people can sort of like amend that, or what can we do to at least to lessen that sort of uh, block between the government as well as people on the grassroots or on the ground? And also, secondly, is there a way for young people to be able to sort of connect with the government? Should they do the usual stuff like protesting and create movement and all that, or should they be more engaging towards the government via some sort of like a dialogue or discussion?
I think in terms of how ASEAN young people can change the intergovernmental policy of non-intervention and even consensus, I think it's going to be very difficult because, of course, as Asians, we have a very cultural approach of respecting one another. I mean, respecting, of course, in inverted commas, not to interfere in one another's actions or policies. But when it comes to human rights and social justice, we are talking about universal principles. And whenever there is injustice, everyone must and should intervene to ensure that their neighbor or their friend who's facing such violation has opportunities for redress, for protection, for the oppression to be stopped. And I think this is where young people have to change the culture of not just in social justice, but the way we think, the way we work. And of course, this will take many years so that maybe someday we may be as open-minded as our counterparts in different parts of the world. And how, of course, your second question of how we are going to do this, I'm still scratching my head for the past few years on how this can be done. But I think movement building is definitely one way to go because the pursuit for justice is a long-term goal. And I mean, we can't do it as individuals or even pocket of individuals, but we have to be connected as a movement. And I think that protests and even engaging governments have to continue. But we have to do it in a creative way because the structures of oppression and injustice are complex. So while we have friends who are doing the protests, we also need friends who are doing the engagement. And I don't see how we can look at this in compartmentalized ways. Yeah.
Anyway, we have we have a very short break. When we return, we will have more discussion, and I'll ask you more questions related to the ASEAN human rights issues in all the different countries.
Sure.
The voice of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Welcome back again. This is Arlene, and you're listening to Adrian, the voice of discovery and sharing. Now, in our segment for Blast from the Grassroots, we are going to continue with Adrian Pereira, who is speaking on the issue related to ASEAN youth participation in human rights. Welcome back again.
Thank you.
So to continue our discussion, I'm just quite curious whether what kind of key issues in ASEAN that has yet to be addressed but is currently being pursued by youth-based human rights movement or youth-based movements in this region?
Yeah, in my past experience, I think young people are still struggling to find spaces to voice out their issues and concerns, either in formal ways or informally. For example, in one of my experiences in ASEAN, in for example, in Cambodia, when the ASEAN meeting was happening, I think young people were actually put in a difficult situation where movements which were informal, the informal sector, meaning they will not have, they may probably not have legal status because of the nature of the work or the nature of the movement, were actually told that they were not able to participate in some of the processes, and this is actually against principles of democracy and human rights. So I think many countries in ASEAN are actually just beginning to learn and experience and even understand what does participatory democracy mean, what is human rights, what is social justice. So even though we have come a long way, it seems that we are still at the very beginning stage of understanding certain principles, and this is quite a difficult stage for ASEAN youth. But of course, at the same time, I think ASEAN youth also have to be self-critical and ask themselves what are their aims in life as individuals and even as a group, as a movement. What is it exactly do they want to achieve? Because without a clear personal vision or even a movemental vision, we may fall into the same trap of business as usual, like how our governments are handling human rights issues. And I think this is where our young people have to be class conscious. What type of dreams they're chasing, because without having that principles and values of justice and even more important, practicing it, that would have a deep impact on what type of issues are being taken up. So, for example, some of my partners in Cambodia, a few very young leaders, they were jailed in January for asking or demanding from their government a minimum wage of 160 USD. And the current offer which the government was mentioning during the negotiations was 80 USD a month. So, I mean, if you compare the disparity with the other countries, where I know in Malaysia, a young yuppie who just graduated, they probably be earning 2,000 to 1.5 thousand USD. So that's how huge the gap is. And even more importantly is what type of solidarity can we support one another in, despite having such huge gaps in terms of economic wise, and even social justice wise, and even ideologically. Yeah.
So, like you just give example when it comes to like employment and wages, but what are other issues that concerns youth in Southeast Asia?
In terms of migration, I think the young people have no choice to migrate. Of course, when I say no choice, it's also a big question mark why governments fail to provide opportunities for good employment, for just wages in their own country, and hence they are forced to cross borders to look for jobs, and this leaves a lot of young people that in very vulnerable conditions, many being exploited by traffickers, by agencies, job agencies which have no values, and I think being away from home has a very deep impact on young people as they work overseas without proper protection from human rights abuses. It's very sad. It's actually very sad that people are forced to migrate and being in very vulnerable positions. And one of my involvement in the ASEAN system is through the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labour, which brings together migrants, senior labor ministries, together with workers' unions, together with NGOs, and even employers. And we come together and we discuss policies on how to improve the situation of migration in ASEAN. And I think this is one of the channels where Dignity would welcome all young people to channel views and concerns on migration. Yeah.
The youth-based civil society in the region, has it been strengthened, or has it been weakened throughout the years? I guess I'm referring since the formation of ASEAN until now.
I think there has been some improvement, but I think the young people are still struggling to sharpen their method of operations and even what goal and vision and mission they have. So while the impact of the voice is still very minimal, I think in terms of movement building, there has been some progress, and this should continue. But like I said before, every movement, especially the young people, have to be self-critical, have to look back at some of the mistakes and also the good methodologies of our seniors and try to improvise. Because the context of oppression 20 years ago is not the same as today. Yeah.
I guess today is more on economic oppression. I guess a lot of issues related to economy. But
definitely, because I remember in the ASEAN meetings, civil society and human rights organizations are given a very superficial role to play within the official ASEAN mechanism. But when it comes to the ASEAN business community, hours and hours of days and even weeks of negotiations take place within the formal official platform. So there is some kind of difference in terms of priorities. And I think the young people, the role would be to apply enough pressure on our respective governments to bring back a more rights-based approach agenda within ASEAN.
And I was a participant at the recent ASEAN Youth Forum, and I also have the same kind of sentiment against what is happening within the grassroots and also what is happening within ASEAN. What I felt personally was the discourse between economy and human rights is not interrelated. It seems like human rights is human rights and economy should be left with those who understand the economy. But I think it should be the discourse between economy and human rights should be going hand in hand together, and you cannot separate the larger ASEAN economy with the issue
agree.
the abuse of human rights, isn't it?
Yes, I totally agree, because many of the human rights abuse we see in the region, be it conflict related or migration related, are merely symptoms of a larger economic oppression. And even though it's the 21st century, a lot of ASEAN governments are still stuck in probably the 60s or 50s in terms of its understanding and practice of justice. And even how human rights and economic justice and even business definitely impact one another and are interrelated. And that's why the young people have to push for a holistic agenda when in terms of ASEAN moving forward.
Another thing about the understanding of ASEAN, I understand that when it comes to ASEAN, the regional awareness among countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand is actually better than compared to other countries like, for example, our own country, Malaysia. And why the regional awareness of ASEAN is not there yet? And do you think it's really important for us to have this sort of regional awareness and regional solidarity?
Yeah, actually, your statement is 50% true, 50% a bit flawed. Why? Because I think Malaysia has played its role when it comes to some of the sensitive issues or conflicts in the region. But of course, you're right, very selective. For example, I think we have intervened or played a peace-building role when I think Mindanao, the conflict is in Mindanao and the Philippine government, and even recently Malaysia tried to broker, inverted commas, peace talks between the Patani liberation movement and even the Thai government. But of course, yes, compared to our neighbors like Thailand, Indonesia, the level of participation is very minimal. Of course, the Malaysian government has managed to keep the minds of Malaysians close in terms of people's participation at the regional level. And they've done this very strategically, and hence you can see people's awareness of not just regional issues but international issues almost nil. I dare to say nil. I remember every time I go to Indonesia, the young people there always question me, what are we doing about our labor policy? How are we affecting, how are our policies affecting the lives of Indonesian migrant workers? But at the same time, when I speak to raise these issues among Malaysian youth, they are almost oblivious about the rights and welfare of migrant workers. So I think.
What kind of question usually they would ask you if it's from Malaysia?
Oh, in Malaysia, in Malaysia, like the similar questions like what they asked Obama. I mean, very shallow questions. But of course, I don't blame the youth. I mean, they have been subjected to a very horrible education system where there's almost zero critical thinking. But of course, the youth have to question themselves, have to be self-critical, because no matter how oppressed we are, we still have that choice to break out from any oppressive system. And that's where I've always been inspired by my friends in Cambodia who despite living in a very oppressive government, they managed to be very brave and ask the difficult questions. For example, the minimum wage of USD 160. But most of my Malaysian friends, driving luxury cars and living the life.
You mean Malaysian friends working in civil society or like in general?
No. I mean in general. Not disconnected from realities of life, but also having different aims and objectives. And hence that also hinders the international and regional solidarity with their neighbors. So this also has to be questioned and challenged. Yep. So it works both ways. That's my point. While there are reasons for us not knowing, taking up other issues, we ourselves could be the problem. Yep.
What about in terms of comparison between the youth movements in ASEAN as well as in probably another region, European Union?
Okay, I think the other mechanisms or regional mechanisms, especially in Europe, they have a very clear systems to enable the young people's participation at various levels, not just at the regional mechanisms, but also at the UN. I remember when I was participating in a UNESCO meeting in 2009, Malaysia actually sent someone from the I think it's the Rakan Muda program to represent Malaysia at this big international forum on education. And when I was interviewing this Malaysian friend and asking her how she got involved, he said she took part in the competition and she got selected after writing a short essay and basically had no clue on what the UN was about and what UNESCO was about. So that shows how serious Malaysia is about its position on human rights, even at the international level. But I think there are a lot of spaces where we can learn from, and from our counterparts in either Europe or even Africa and even ASEAN, like you mentioned, Indonesia, Philippines, how their young people play a role in the system. Yeah.
Do you think the governments of ASEAN, or at least the government of Malaysia, if you can comment on it, actually want to take this matter seriously in terms of the issue of human rights in ASEAN?
I think it's inevitable. Sooner or later, they will have to deal with it because the nature of conflict and the nature of human rights violation and injustice is now cross-border. So whether they want or they don't want, it's happening already, and we should support any genuine efforts taken by a government to improve human rights and social justice. And I think every individual and every movement has a role to play to mainstream this agenda.
So, talking about ASEAN, right? What about ICHR, the ASEAN Human Rights Charter? Do you think it's effective, or do you think it's actually more of a show to for ASEAN towards the world that we also have a human rights charter?
Of course, it took civil society many years to pressure the ASEAN governments, trying to convince them that there is a need to have a human rights mechanism. At the moment, it's still at a very superficial level. Some countries in ASEAN have taken it very seriously and have implemented open spaces for people to participate and voice out their concerns about human rights abuse. But other countries are still at the starting line, still at point zero where they are contemplating probably how to avoid more human rights than deal with it. So the different countries are at different stages, and I think in terms of Malaysia, we definitely have to improve our engagement, especially the different government departments and agencies, having more dialogue with civil society in a genuine manner. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of work to do, and once again, we need young people to push this agenda.
So, talking about young people, what is your view on the youth movement in Malaysia? Do you think it has grown from probably 20 years ago, or has it been like in a way that it is still at a very infant stage?
In terms of growth, I haven't really had sufficient time to do a deeper cross-cutting analysis of our youth movement. But I think even whenever there is a human rights violation, I think the voice of young people are still quite minimal, and that's why I challenge the youth of Malaysia to break out from our tempurung, our coconut shell. Ask difficult questions. I think start by asking difficult questions. Challenge the oppressive system when not to be happy with the answers given by anyone. I'm not just talking about the government, but by anyone. And hopefully, by having critical thinking, we'll be able to take on human rights issues and social justice more seriously. Of course, whenever I have this conversation with my yuppie friends, who drive big cars, and they tell me that
living the capitalistic dream, I guess.
I mean, yes. I mean, everybody is guilty of that of that type of thinking, because we live in a very material world, and consumerism, hedonism. These are the current values and dominating systems that are actually integrated or indoctrinated into the minds of our youth, and we have to come up with creative ways to help them think and see the world in a different rights-based lens.
Talking about that, what kind of issues usually the youth in Malaysia would raise, at least the youth movements in Malaysia or youth civil society?
For example, in my experience with young people from Borneo.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually part of a movement called the School of Acting Justly, Loving Tenderly, and Treading Humbly, also known as SALT. Currently, we are actively participating in a few anti-dam campaigns, especially in Baram and in the Ulu Papa region in Sabah and Sarawak, because the Malaysian government has gone on a dam building frenzy in these two regions, and I think it's important that we look at it from an environmental justice perspective and evaluate what are the impacts of such dams, what is the democratic processes involved in grassroots being part of this decision making, or whether the dam is important or whether it's not. So, of course, currently the young people still at the very basic participation due to the secrecy that is hiding a lot of facts and information about the building of dams.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is one of the challenges, but I'm very happy to see a group of young people actually rejecting the conventional hegemonic thinking, practicing optional poverty themselves, and spending time and personal resource to engage in this campaign. So I think we have good role models, very few, but I think we can definitely build more movement and multiply. Yeah.
It's interesting when I was in Myanmar mingling with the youth in different ASEAN countries. I learned that in Myanmar, for example, the youth there would they have gone beyond just doing protests and movement. They are moving beyond towards formulating youth policy, having youth groups in different states and different regions of the country, and they are also engaging directly with government officials on critical issues. And in fact, they are a voice of their own. They are not like for example, in Malaysia, where youth, if youth in politics would be like youth joining political party, joining the youth wing of any particular political party. So, do you think another example is in Thailand, where the young people there, they are, even though they are being restricted by the military junta, they are, doing protests in very creative ways, such as having reading while protesting, having that three fingers sign and all that. But when it comes to Malaysia, what can you make out of it in terms of comparing Malaysian youth with the youth from other countries?
Comparing Malaysian youth to other countries, I think Malaysian youth is still in sleeping mode, but
I guess what my question is more towards, like, in terms of political awareness of the country.
Yeah, I mean the nature of politics in Malaysia. I mean, for example, engaging with the different government institutions and agencies is still very superficial and weak levels. I mean, for myself personally to actually get an appointment with any government department or agency, it's almost impossible, because that has been the system for many years. But I think young people can actually look at how, for example, our friends in Myanmar are doing it, how our friends in Indonesia are doing it. I mean, they have their creative ways, and we must break out from this thinking that young people can only contribute through official channels, only by being involved with a political party, or by only being a member of Majlis Belia Malaysia. There's so many other channels where young people can play at grassroots to local councils. For example, I personally challenge the Selangor and Penang governments, which are run under the so-called opposition. I mean, to what degree have or what type of empowerment programs or even human rights programs have they been talking about? I mean, most of our friends in the human rights movement have joined joined the government in these two states, but you can hardly see any good human rights programs. So this is my challenge. I mean, while we may be very critical to the federal government, we must look at our own backyard and question. And to me, even in these two states, the youth programs are still very superficial and not empowering to right-based standards.
So I guess it's still a long way, but I think
very long way.
A very long way. What else that you want to add on in terms of covering the ASEAN youth participation in human rights?
Yeah, for me personally, because I've been working on the issues of conflict for quite some time, I think it's important that the young people in Malaysia show solidarity and concern for our Malay Muslim neighbours in Patani, which is actually part of Thailand. I think since the Takbai incident in 2004, more than 5,000 people have been killed and another 5,000 disappeared. So I think young people should actually take or be aware of what's going on. Try to visit our friends in these regions and show solidarity for social justice and human rights, because there will come a time when we as Malaysians may face situations like that, and we should not wait for such things to happen before we start being aware and start taking action. But we should start sharing and building the solidarity, building the movement in the ASEAN region from now itself.
Anyway, thank you very much for speaking with us, Adrian Pereira. It's been a very interesting conversation with you.
Thank you for allowing me to share my opinions, and long live international solidarity.
Yeah, thank you.